Epilogue. Runt returned to China. Though he had intended to be there for only half a year, his parents kept finding excuses for him to stay, so they drew out his short visit to 4 years. Unfortunately, Uncle Stone was right about Runt's marriage prospects. Now that he was rich, many families were interested in him as a groom. Though he was still young, families began to ask about a possible match. Frantically, Runt got Uncle Stone to order his return to the Golden Mountain. Safely back in San Francisco, he met the native-born daughter of a Chinese merchant in Chinatown. When they were both 18, they married and began to raise a large family. Runt never went back to China. Runt's language skills, knowledge of other cultures, and friendships with non-Chinese made him a key figure in Chinatown. He was active in fighting the anti-Chinese laws that America began to pass. In Chinatown, it was said that though Runt never grew very tall, he cast a giant shadow. Uncle Stone never did go back to China, but stayed in California. He started numerous businesses and banking ventures, but he always sold his interests so he could start his new scheme. As a result, he never stayed with any of his enterprises long enough to reap the fruits of success. Nonetheless, Chinatown respected him as a man with foresight. It was said that without him, half of Chinatown wouldn't have come into existence. He always had a place at his nephew's table. Though Blessing never got to come to the Golden Mountain, 3 of his sons became guests. The Fox and his crew helped reclaim some 217,000 acres from the Sacramento Delta. He later became a labor contractor, supplying Chinese workers for the many industries and farms that were starting up all over the West. He provided some of the 12,000 Chinese who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. One of those was Prosperity, who then went on to help build many of the railroad branches. He never did repay what he owed to the Fox, though. The Golden Mountain cast its spell on Runt's friends as much as it did upon him. They all stayed in California. Though Esteban's brothers returned to Chile, Esteban stayed in Monterey, where he worked his way up at a small hotel until eventually he owned it. Throughout, he retained his love for fishing and could often be found along the rivers or coast casting out his line. Brian chased various silver and gold strikes around the world. Good fortune always eluded him, however, until he came back to San Francisco. There, his friendly ways made him a successful politician. Hiram became a farmer, finally settling in the rich fields of the Sacramento Delta that the Fox and his crew had helped reclaim. He remained a staunch friend of the Chinese, even in the middle of the anti-Chinese riots of the 1880s. He defied mobs and refused to fire his Chinese hired hands through his barn he burned down twice. Jubal and his master quickly ran into trouble into the gold fields. The American miners objected to working alongside a slave. After trying several districts, his discouraged master released Jubal, who fought his way to San Francisco. There he apprenticed himself to a tailor. Later, he published his own newspaper, The Elevator, devoted to African-American issues, and established friendships with several of San Francisco's literary figures. Life in America in 1852. Historical note. On January 24, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold while contracting a sawmill for Captain John Sutter. Since John Sutter's goal was to build his own colony in California, he and James Marshall tried to keep it a secret. However, word leaked out, and by the summer, cities like Monterey and San Francisco were deserted. Everyone had headed for places such as Coloma and Sonora and Hangtown, later renamed Placerville. Back east, people were skeptical until President James K. Polk confirmed the reports on December 5th. Suddenly, the rush was on. Since there was as yet no transcontinental railroad, Americans were forced to choose among several dangerous routes to California. One sea route went all the way around South America, but the storms at the tip, Cape Horn, often proved deadly. The shorter sea route was no less risky. Would-be prospectors landed on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama and walked to the Pacific side of the board another ship. However, during the walk, it was possible to contract many diseases, including yellow fever. Even though a railroad was built across the isthmus in 1855, the threat of illness remained. The land routes were just as hazardous, and yet many set out by wagon, by horse, and on foot. In their eagerness, they developed on poorly written guidebooks that often led to dangerous, even fateful situations. Because of the gold discoveries, California became a state on September 9th, 1850. There was little in the way of an American government there. No one was prepared for all the people flooding into the new state. By the end of 1849, some 89,000 had reached California by both land and sea. Lawlessness was widespread. Many miners became discouraged when the gold proved so difficult to find. The news went around the world. On almost every continent, people jammed ships to reach California. Once there, sailors left their ships and joined the passengers to rush to the gold fields. The San Francisco anchorage was filled with abandoned ships. The pragmatic San Franciscans converted many of the ships into homes, hotels, and even a prison. Later, when they expanded the shoreline, they simply filled in the water around the ships. As a result, buried ships are still being unearthed today. People around the world took part in the gold rush. Mexicans joined the local Hispanic population. Australians came in a sizable contingent and as did Europeans and South Americans, especially Chileans. Southerners brought their slaves to the diggings as well. When the miners came to California in 1849, prices for food shot right through the roof. A single egg could cost up to $3 and an onion $2. Women were scarce in California at the time. However, a few women who made it to California were tough and resourceful. They founded many legitimate businesses and even prospected for gold. One even drove a staggered coach. Only the Native Americans failed to profit from the gold rush. A disguised form of slavery began by the Spanish missions. A disguised form of slavery began by the Spanish missions continued, and Native American women and boys were sold into slavery until 1863. When Native Americans tried to protect themselves, they were killed, sometimes in wholesale massacres. Bounties were offered for their scalps. In both 1851 and 1852, bounty hunters were paid a total of $1 million for the scalps of Native Americans. A few Chinese had made their way to San Francisco before the gold rush. Life in China was very difficult. Many were starving. Desperate for survival, people were willing to gamble their lives to reach California. By 1852, there was an estimated 25,000 Chinese there. Originally, the foreign miners' tax was aimed at all non-Americans, including Europeans. The license fee was set at $20 a month, a high sum for many of the miners who were barely surviving. Fights almost broke out between American and foreign miners over the tax. American merchants, afraid of losing so many foreign customers, protested. The fee was reduced and eventually repealed. However, by 1852, the tax was reenacted because of the negative feelings against the Chinese miners. Though the fee was set at $3 a month, it was now collected from only the Chinese. In 1853, the fee was raised to $4, and in 1856 to $6. The tax collectors were allowed to use force in order to obtain the money, part of which they kept. By 1862, 11 Chinese had been murdered by tax collectors. Only 2 collectors were ever convicted and hanged. Many districts gathered a large amount of money from the tax. In early California, non-whites had no legal protection. In 1849, a law was passed that said no black or mulatto person or Indian shall be permitted to give evidence in favor of or against any white person. Soon the California courts included Chinese in the law and refused to accept their testimony as well. An amazing amount of gold was found in California. In 1848, 11,866 troy ounces of gold were taken from the rivers and diggings at a value of $245,301. There are 12 troy ounces to a pound. In 1850, 1,996,586 troy ounces were taken at a value of $41,273,106. The richest year of all time was 1852, with a total of 3,932,631 troy ounces at a value of $81,294,700. However, the gold was taken at an enormous cost of the environment. Even to this day, it is left what one geologist has called moonscapes, where no plants can grow. Between 1854 and 1884, hydraulic mining shifted 1.5 billion cubic yards of debris, the same as digging 8 Panama canals. Much of that debris moved down the rivers, choking the bays. It has thickened the floor of San Francisco by 1 to 2 yards. Worse, quartz mining used mercury to extract the gold, poisoning the environment. For better or worse, the California gold rush transformed many lives here and abroad. A few miners returned home rich, but far more found themselves poorer than ever. Many miners stayed in California and made their homes there. They returned to farm the rich, fertile fields, which they had once ignored in their hurry to reach the gold fields. Or they went to the cities to become merchants or start factories. They became doctors and engineers, bankers and lawyers, writers and artists. In short, they became the people who helped build California. The Golden Mountain also forever changed the Southern Chinese. They didn't need gold, just American money, so they found other work here in America. And increasingly in troubled times, their remittance were able to keep their families alive back in China. In an underpopulated state, these Chinese pioneers proved the raw, cheap labor that made California's factories and large farms possible. Without the Chinese, California would never have developed so fast. Later, the Chinese helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, joining the two coasts forever. The gold rush changed how Americans dreamed. Before 1848, Americans went west for cheap land. After the gold rush, the West began to mean quick fortunes, whether it was in gold or oil or some other scheme. And even today, California continues to draw people who see it as a place to make their dreams become reality.